Susan Opotow. She is one of the co-authors of New York After 9/11. She's also a professor at the City University of New York. Susan, it's a pleasure to have you with us on this historic day. Before we kind of get into sort of the analysis of what has happened between then, can you just share with us your reflections on this day 20 years later?
Yeah, it's a time to really go back to where we were. It feels like almost a lifetime ago. And for some, it's even more than that. So the whole generation has grown up in the shadow of this event, and it's an event that won't be forgotten in future generations up to a point. And it has a very, I think, important meaning that we all come together in our own way with our own experience and reflect on the past. There's the sense of shock that we had, the sense of fragility that we had as individuals and as a nation, but also, all that's happened in between. The time in between has not been a time that's always been on the front page of the news, but a lot has happened that's emerged from that day.
And speaking of that, in your book, as you mentioned, there's a lot of focus on the events of that day, but also where America is 20 years later. Your book focuses on what happened in between. What were some of those discoveries?
Yeah, well, we looked at several major areas. I think they're all so key. Public safety was clearly an issue of importance and of concern. And over the years, there's a lively literature that traces those issues, both appreciatively and critically. The issue of health is incredibly poignant because we've now surpassed in death the number of people who responded to the event and survived than those who died. And so the memorial now has a dual role. It was actually revised to include a section to the people who have died since. When we look back on that, of everything everybody done, the first responders, we also can look back critically to understand that the perimeter of toxic dust was not properly set up in this case, and the precautionary principle would have saved a lot of lives. It took communities, it took a coalition of community members, doctors, occupational health doctors, and law and labor unions together to almost, I would say, encourage, but force is more likely, the government to take this health issue seriously, and their work paid off.
What are some of the lasting psychological impacts of the September 11th attacks?
Yeah, well, it's, psychological trauma is usually measured with PTSD, and it did wane, but not equally for all groups. The groups that were most affected were the first responders, actually non-traditional ones who were not from our own system and may have had less access because they were independent and so generous to come and help that they, in fact, have experienced the longest term PTSD. But it wanes over time, just the way the city's health has revived. But, today reminds us of the shock and, again, the precarity of life and how people came together. The fact that we supported each other in any way we could, as individuals, as communities, as cities, and the nation ultimately came to to give us the support we needed. This is such an important lesson from that, because social support is probably the most important psychological thing that can happen.
One segment of society, Susan, that I think was profoundly impacted by the events of the day was clearly the Muslim American community when New York was surveilling those communities. Can you talk to us a little bit about the impact that it's had there?
Yes, there was an amazing study done on this by Clear at CUNY Law School, and Diala Shamas wrote a beautiful chapter on that, and the chapter is I say beautiful, but it was a bit horrifying. It mostly focused on CUNY students, Muslim CUNY students, who had a tremendously chilling effect that they were under surveillance. They didn't know who they were talking to when they were talking to people in their supposed group. There was all kinds of ways that they were exposed to scrutiny that was terrifying, and where they were unfree academically, socially, in terms of their worship, and that doesn't go away. It was a self-inflicted wound that was really unfortunate and that hasn't really ended.
Susan Opotow, we have to wrap it there. There would be so much more to discuss with you, but we really appreciate you being with us.